Show, an international faith-based show where we provide a platform for entrepreneurs within the 5 C's: Christ, cannabis, cryptocurrency, cybersecurity, and certified public accountants. Here at the CryptoCannaVerse Show, we strive to assist entrepreneurs in growing their businesses by connecting them with investors, advisors, and partnerships opportunities. I am your show host, Crystal Wampler, and joining me is my amazing co-host, Alan Lau. Our show schedule is jam-packed. We are booked through January 2024, but if you're interested in being a guest or accessing our current deal flow, please reach out to Crystal at CannEthics.com. You can be ethical in business. Today's show is being broadcast live across various platforms, including Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Our network has an array of business owners, Web3 launchpads, VCs, family offices, blockchain hedge funds, high net worth CPAs, attorneys, investors, and angel investors. Before introducing our esteemed guest speaker, Alan, will you please share today's Bible verse?
Thank you, Crystal. Welcome to CryptoCannaVerse Show, everyone. Thank you for your time on Friday. Today's Bible verse comes from Deuteronomy 31:6-8, and it reads, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all Israel, "Be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them, and you must divide among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid and do not be discouraged." I think the story goes back to how God spoke to Moses to bring the Israelites out of Israel because they were being treated poorly and badly by Pharaoh. And God spoke to Moses and said, "Hey, you're going to be the leader to lead the Israelites out of slavery," and just reassuring Moses that, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. You have been appointed to do God's work. And you just always remember, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I want you to take the Israelites out of slavery and divide up their inheritance into the promised land. So very comforting verse. I love the story because oftentimes we go through difficulties and go through tough times where, God is always going to be there. He's never going to leave you. He's never going to forsake you. Do not be afraid and do not be discouraged. So it's actually a very, very encouraging verse, Crystal. I love it.
Thank you, Alan, for sharing that encouraging verse. The CryptoCannaVerse Show presents speaker Peter Hsu, board member and treasurer for the Asian Cannabis Roundtable. Today, Friday, August 11th, 2023. Peter Hsu is a longtime banker with 20+ years of experience, and he has successfully launched and scaled 2 separate cannabis banking programs. Then, as a consultant, he launched and grew over 100 cannabis programs nationwide. Peter is an active member in the cannabis community and is currently on the Leadership Advisory Council for the Minority Cannabis Academy, a Black-owned adult learning institution in New Jersey. He is also an executive board member and treasurer for the Asian Cannabis Roundtable. Additionally, Peter writes about the cannabis industry for Rolling Stone's Cannabis Culture Council. Welcome, Peter Hsu, to the CryptoCannaVerse Show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I apologize. I didn't know you were going to read the whole thing. I would have wrote a shorter bio.
Your bio is actually one of the shortest bios that I have. So you did very well. Thank you. It's short and sweet, and it's jam-packed with so many amazing things. So first, I'd like to start with, Peter, can you tell us when and why you actually entered the cannabis industry?
Sure. I'm aware that this is a sensitive question in the cannabis industry, which is How did you get into the cannabis industry? I'm going to apologize in advance and tell you that I don't have a good story. I'm a banker, and the bank that I worked for wanted to get into cannabis, and I said, you know, I can do that for you. That said, let me take a little detour here because it's relevant for the show. I was working at a bank, doing well, I think, but I felt that the people that I knew that tended to do really well, they tended to specialize in something. They had a very particular niche. And again, this is where it's relevant for this show. What kind of finally pushed me out of the nest was the bank that I worked for. I'm not going to say their name, but you can easily look it up. Keep in mind, this is like 8 years ago. They hired a team that were crypto banking experts. So 8 years ago, these guys were experts at banking crypto. And wow. I remember thinking to myself, okay, you are kind of speaking this into existence, aren't you? And look, good for them. That program went on to become one of the largest in the world. I mean, that program by itself, that team by itself was managing like $20 billion in deposits. Again, one of the largest, which unfortunately probably later contributed to the bank's demise. But the point is, seeing that, I thought, you know what, I've got to pull the pin. I'm going to jump out of the nest and do the same thing. And so there was an opportunity where there was a bank that wanted to launch a cannabis banking program. And again, we're talking, you know, 7 years ago now. And I thought, that's greenfield, right? Like, nobody is doing this. And so I just kind of jumped in and, you know, head first. So yes, unfortunately, it's not a very personally meaningful story. I basically saw an opportunity and I said, I can do that.
No, I think that's an amazing story. The fact that you entered into an industry that wasn't very well known at the time, and you took the leap of faith and, you know, pioneered in cannabis banking is a wonderful story. So thank you for sharing that with us. And you're not going to share the bank name then,
Well, you know, I don't want to make it sound like I'm talking.
You could say rhymes with no.
I mean, who are the biggest crypto banks, right? And which ones is no longer around?
That's true. That's true. I'm not going to name any names either, but that's a pretty good lead into what it might be. So, you know, you're extremely active in the cannabis community. Can you tell us more about, you know, your roles with the Minority Cannabis Academy and the Asian Cannabis Roundtable?
Sure. Actually, Crystal, I gave you the short version of that. I've served on, like, I think every committee. I was on the NCIA Banking and Financial Services Committee. I chaired the New York City Cannabis Industry Association. I started the ASTM International's Banking and Financial Services Committee. But again, I rotated through some of those roles. Currently, the only ones I kept, I am the treasurer for Asian Cannabis Roundtable. So Asian Cannabis Roundtable, it's Asians in cannabis, people of Asian descent working in the cannabis industry. We want to insert the Asian voice, right? Our place at the table. We want to sort of uplift the next generation, right? Are there Asians that are looking into the cannabis industry that perhaps want to network with established Asians? You know, in the Asian community, the stigma of cannabis is actually very strong, especially with the older generation. A funny thing in Chinese, in Mandarin, so the word that we use for drugs, right? So in English, you have the word drug, which could be medicinal or it could be narcotic. Well, we have the word for medicine, and the word that we use for narcotics is actually poison. So in other words, a Mandarin speaker grows up thinking of cannabis, of marijuana, as poison. And that's powerful, right? The stigma of that, when I talk to, like, my parents or whatever, and they say, well, what are you doing now? I don't tell them that I'm banking cannabis, for example. However, we want to change that for the next generation, because it doesn't have to be poison. It could be medicine. It could be, you know, recreational. That those are all okay words to use as well. For the Minority Cannabis Academy, so that is a Black-owned adult continuing education platform They target disenfranchised communities, markets where people have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. My role is more teacher related. So we come in, we sort of, so I, of course, banking, financing. I teach things like reading a P&L, how to run business accounts, balance a checkbook, things like that. All great missions. I mean, these are great organizations, but with great missions.
That's amazing work that you're doing. So you're telling me that you can't talk to your parents about cannabis, like what you're doing, your work?
I can. I guess I'm just trying to say that the stigma is very strong. You know, in the Chinese culture anyway. Then we have then it gets really deep, right? Now you have the opium wars and the mental scars from that and stuff like that. So yeah, I think in the Asian community, specifically Southeast Asians, that is not that topic is very taboo. Keep in mind, in a place like China, like that is still a capital offense. You get executed for cannabis.
I would agree to what Peter said, because I grew up in an Asian family, and the topic is very sensitive.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm actually very surprised that, what about holistic medication doctors in, let's say, China, for example? And I use China as an example because there's documented over 3,000 years of them using it as holistic medication. That's the first known actual documented human use prior to, or I think you do that prior to or just after the Bible references of it.
No, 100%. I mean, there's a lot of irony when you think about that. I think most scientists agree that cannabis as a plant originated from Asia. So the irony in it becoming so stigmatized in Asian culture now, it is something that is not lost on us, right? And we, as this current generation, we want to change that.
That's awesome.
And I think about education too. I think that's kind of why we get together and educate the mass public about the medicinal purpose of it, the other types of benefits behind it. So I think that's important. That's what this group is for, is to educate, inspire, and grow. And hopefully everyone out there can learn.
I couldn't agree more. That's what we do.
That's wonderful information. You know, we always hear about the Safe Banking Act. You know, it's been up for debate like 11 different times. Do you think that we'll ever pass Senate?
So 10 years, just about 10 years, 9 attempts. This is the 9th attempt. You know, it's sort of funny when I think back. It's funny because I was just recently thinking about this. If we think back to when it was first introduced, so 10 years ago, believe it or not, safe banking was considered low-hanging fruit. In other words, let's be fair. Back then, 10 years ago, there were only medical programs, right? So let's table that for a second because I have a point to make there. So it was only medical programs, but there was this sort of like, well, we're really far apart on this idea of federal legalization. But hey, we can all agree that legal businesses should have access to banking, right? And so safe banking was sort of this like, all right, let's throw this out there because it's really easy. We could totally get this done. 10 years and 9 attempts later, clearly it is not low-hanging fruit. And the question is now, are we actually closer to federal legalization or, you know, descheduling, rescheduling, or are we closer to safe banking? And what does safe banking do for us today? So as I mentioned, I do think that having gone recreational or adult use did play a role in safe banking not passing, because I think that people were very okay psychologically with the idea of it being medicine. So when it was medical only states, when every program was medical only, it was like, all right, boom, let's do this. We can do safe banking. And then let's talk about the next step, right? And then, but what happened? Well, all these adult use programs started legalizing. And I do think the stigma is very strong with that. Again, we're talking a lot about that, right? So, you know, I would love to see safe banking pass because I think that overall net, it would be a positive for the industry. However, I think, again, to be fair, 10 years and 9 attempts later, the effects of safe banking has significantly diluted over the years to the extent that if it passed, let's say tomorrow, I don't know what practical impact it would actually have, because and I think you can all agree, the reality is that cannabis industry today, cannabis business today, can define banking. So here we have to define what is safe banking. When we think about it, because it's called safe banking, right? We assume they're talking about a bank account. So if it just means a checking account, honestly, the practical impact of it is not much. Not much, because most cannabis companies are able to find banking. Now, if it means things like capital markets, right, uplisting to the major publics, if it means credit cards, right, you may have heard it's a topic. If it means things like that, that would be a sea change. But again, if it just literally means you can open a checking account at your local bank, that is already happening. And it's happening because 10 years ago, when SAFE was introduced, most banks, most institutions assumed that it was going to pass, and they planned with that in mind.
Do you have names of the specific banks that are in your neighborhood that are allowing that?
Well, I could throw out names, yes, but let's look at a couple of statistics, right? So FinCEN, the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, which is a function of the Treasury, they actually track a statistic. They track how many banks, or financial institutions rather, which means banks, credit unions, et cetera. They actually track a number that they say is banking cannabis. Their number is 695. So in other words, there are 695, almost 700 institutions filing a SAR, a suspicious activity report, which is how FinCEN is tracking this number. And again, we can see the progression of that. Back in like 2015, let's say that number was closer to like 300. Today, that number is closer to 700. So these institutions are filing SARs to their regulator or a regulatory agency, and nothing is happening to them, meaning they're not being fined, they're not being censured, they're not being told to shut down their program. Right? So what does that imply? It implies, I think, in my opinion, this is my opinion, it implies that the status that safe banking would have proposed, it already exists. Now, if you want to look at public examples of names, so PBC publishes a list of banks and credit unions that are banking cannabis, right? This is public, you can look it up. Now their list is significantly less. It's something I want to say off the top of my head, it's like 50 names or so across the country, some of which have national programs, meaning they're willing to bank in every state, legal state, of course. Now I will say that most insiders believe that the FinCEN number is way too high. There's no way there's anywhere near 700, right? We believe the number is closer to like 150, maybe 200-ish. Now that's across the entire country. So 38 medical states, 23 adult use states. So sure, if we divide 200 across the state, that's only a handful in any given state. That I think is pretty accurate. I think we could agree that in any given state, you can find a handful of institutions that are willing to bank cannabis. So the answer is yes, absolutely. And there's actually an official statistic that a government agency tracks.
Yeah, Peter, I think those numbers are far more accurate. I think to get to that 700 number, one of the things you have to do as a bank is, if you're interested in being in this space, one of your first steps is you have to file the cannabis-related SAR. Simply that indicates we are going to pursue something in cannabis, or we have some sort of active interest. But when you look at the number of banks who are actually involved here, I think it's much closer to that, probably 150 or so number of, I shouldn't say, it's really financial institutions. Of those, probably the vast majority are credit unions, as opposed to, regular banks. But, in essence, a credit union can provide, much the same type of banking facility. And I think also, coming back to the passage of safe banking, one of the other things the feds have always sought to tack on is, if we're going to pass this, we're going to tax it at the federal level as well.
Yeah.
And you have an industry which today is already being killed at the retail level by having onerous state and local taxes, onerous state and local regulations, and therefore piling on additional federal taxes and additional federal regulations may not be particularly helpful.
Yeah, so Bob is right. The reason why the FinCEN statistic is so far off, we believe, is because of how they track it. They track it based on SARs, suspicious activity reports. So the question is, what is a cannabis business? Right. So believe it or not, there's not an official definition of what is not a cannabis business. So here's my example for you. If this show has an account somewhere and it's actually called, cannabis something, the likelihood is the bank would file a suspicious activity report for this company, even though it's not a plant touching business, et cetera, et cetera. So take this example, multiply it by, any number of examples just like it. That's the reason why their number is so much higher.
Yeah, and to that point, Peter, there are three different types of SARs that are filed. One is simply, indicating that we as a bank are interested in being this business. The second is to your point about the show has the name cannabis and wants to open up a bank account. Then we have to file a suspicious activity report related to the fact that we may be engaging with a business that's somehow or another involved in cannabis.
Yeah.
The flip side to all of this is if you're a cannabis business, whether you're an ancillary business or a plant touching business, and you do get a bank account, that bank account is extremely expensive. Maybe you can educate us a little bit more on the types of costs that you see out there for cannabis related businesses, as what it actually costs to have, maintain, and then run money through that account.
Yeah, so I tend to say when I talk about cannabis banking, this idea that cannabis banking doesn't exist, that's a little bit of a myth. It does exist. It's even, I might even use the word robust, right? Like there's plenty of capacity. So the question for me is really capability, capacity, and cost. So to Bob's point, you're a cannabis business, you walk into a bank, how much does it cost you? What are they willing to do for you? And how many of those banks can you find? So again, capability, capacity, and cost. All of which I think has improved a lot over time, believe it or not. In the early days, for those of you that remember the early days of like Colorado, California, it was pretty common to hear people paying, $10,000 a month for a basic checking account.
Yeah.
And I do mean basic checking account, like literally you can put money in the bank, you can take money out of the bank, and that's it. You can't do anything else, and it was, of course, completely cash only back then. I think the pricing has gone down dramatically. In some markets, there's actually, it's actually gotten competitive. So national average is around $1,000 a month. So that's a base, call it a compliance cost, right? That's just you opening an account, costs about $1,000. Now, national average, it's a big country. Certain markets like Massachusetts, for example, there's actually institutions now going out there advertising, zero cost. Here, of course, I think we all appreciate there's a little marketing magic, right? There's different ways to skin a cat. So, for example, I'm aware there's a credit union that will say, okay, it won't cost you anything provided that you use our payment gateway. So in other words, they're making their money in a different way. So here's where I pause and I defend my brethren and I say, well, the thing is, it does cost us more money to bank cannabis. It does. And the reason for that is that the regulatory burden of banking cannabis is significantly higher than that of any other industry.
Yeah.
So in other words, it costs me more money to bank one cannabis business than it does. If I had to crack down the numbers, I would say I could run a much bigger book, like hundreds of accounts more, if I was not focused on cannabis versus just one cannabis business.
Are you saying that that's the monthly minimum, or that's actually a monthly fee?
Average. That's a national average of what banks and credit unions charge as a base fee, right? Just
is the base? Okay.
You open an account, it's going to cost you $1,000.
That's why I was like, wait, hold on, is that monthly or is that the initial fee? That
Well,
No,
okay, so
And I
then it
think
does
that fee will vary depending on whether or not you're a plant touching business or an ancillary business.
yeah. So again, what
For
is a
plant
cannabis
touching,
business,
it's
right?
probably 2, 3, 4 times as high as an ancillary business.
Then of course it gets complicated, right? Like what are you using an account for? So
Yeah.
for example, if you have cash couriers, so Joseph, if you have a plant touching business and you guys have a lot of cash, you're getting cash couriers and stuff like that, right? Well, that's part of your account cost.
Yeah, that's liability as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's we're an ancillary and not plant touching, and
Yeah.
but we're also banking with one of the big banks, so I guess that's the cost of doing business with them rather than a credit union.
Well, I'll tell you what, give me a call. I'll get you a better deal.
And you guys
we'll definitely talk.
when you guys are handling cash, I remember when I was working at a bank for business accounts or commercial accounts, there's typically a cash management fee on a monthly basis. And you mentioned that your cost is built, your cash management service is built into your monthly cost. Is that right?
No.
Or is that? Oh no. Okay.
No. Yeah. So cash is not an unusual thing necessarily, right? Like there are cash intensive businesses, I don't know, restaurants, for example, bars, things like that.
Right.
So the reality is those companies also pay elevated account fees, but that's because they have all these ancillary services like smart safes, armor pickups. I mean, think about armor pickups, how expensive that is, right? So that is actually a relatively normal thing, right? So if you're in a cash business, you pay more. So I'm talking specifically about cannabis, the cannabis charge.
Gotcha.
I had a question. If there's like a cannabis client here looking for a bank, do you have advice what they should look for in a bank or how to guide them in, the right direction? Because I know a lot of people are looking and it gets kind of tricky. Is there prices they need to look for, names or?
So again, the dynamic has changed so much that I actually would say at this point, you're in a competitive situation. It's not like, 2 years ago, even a year ago, right? Don't just take don't feel like, oh, thank God I found somebody. like ask questions. You can actually shop around now. Like one thing I would love to see people ask is experience. So for example, there's a lot of new cannabis banking programs that pop up. And sometimes, this used to happen a lot. Banks would get in and then get out because they would start banking cannabis and then realize, wow, there's a lot of work. We don't like it. It's costing too much money. We're not making enough money, whatever the reason is, right? So that would be a concern that I would have. Like if I was trying to find an account today, I would ask the bank, like, first of all, do you have approval all the way through, right? Or is this you, the salesperson, going rogue and saying, yeah, I could bank cannabis, right? Assuming you have a legit cannabis banking program somewhere, right? Then I would ask, do you have other cannabis companies that you're working with? Because I would be concerned about them deciding to get out. So in other words, you've gone through all this trouble, you've paid some fees, and then 6 months down the road, you've got to close that account and go somewhere else. It's just annoying, I guess. And then lastly, the stopping, right? If you could put yourself in a situation where you're pitting a couple of FIs against each other, financial institutions against each other, you're in a competitive situation where you have to say, well, you're charging me $1,000 a month. They're telling me, $600 a month.
It's so funny you
That's
say
great
that,
advice.
that complacency feeling that, oh, thank God we have one. That's, that resonates very, very much with me. As soon as you said that, I was like, oh, that's, he's right. I shouldn't just be happy with it.
Well, believe it or not, a lot of bank marketing depends on inertia. So statistics show that people, open an account somewhere and then they kind of forget about it because it goes on autopilot, right? So for example, with rates, when people only shop for rates when they're looking, right? So you're only looking when you're looking. I know that sounds like a stupid statement, but you've got $100,000 and you got a CD, right? You're only looking at that CD rate when it matures. That's the only time you ever shop. So what do? You offer bonuses, right? Oh, open an account this week. It's 8%. Everybody else is paying 6%, and you see a bank offering 8%. Well, what happens is you open that account and you just forget about it.
No, you're 100% right. It's almost like the mindset of day trading, but at a long-term investment.
Those are great questions, you guys. Peter, you have launched over 100+ cannabis programs nationwide. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can't say they're all successful because some programs. This bolsters, I believe, my argument. I've actually seen situations over the last couple of years where a bank or credit union, and look, they pay fees and stuff like that, right? We consult, we help them put a program together, the policies, and we're talking a month-long, possibly a year-long process of getting a cannabis program off the ground. And what winds up happening is this failure to launch, meaning they can't get business. So that's how competitive the situation is now, believe it or not. There are a number of institutions that go out there and wind up not being able to find enough business to justify the program continuing. If that is any sort of evidence, but what goes into launching a cannabis program, and again, I keep repeating this, but honestly, there's a lot of just education, because we have to overcome stigma. We have to overcome. So here's an example. I still get this question a lot where people ask me, so banks are asking me, does the money smell? Why would the money smell? Why would the money smell?
That's great. That's
so
awesome question.
So it's the stigma, it's this presumption of there's this stereotype of this stoner pulling up in a mystery van, and a waft of smoke is going to follow him or her into the branch, and he's going to hand you a stack of money that smells like weed. Now, we know that that's not true, right? We know that doesn't happen. And of course, you can obviously prevent that even if that were true, because of course they will send cash couriers, right? It's not that guy driving up in a van. It's an armed courier that goes and picks up the cash. But that's what we're dealing with, right? People think that that there is an image, just years of training, that this is what the cannabis industry is like. So believe it or not, there's a lot of that goes into sort of just education, overcoming that stigma. Unfortunately, when you deal with senior management executives, when you deal with boards, by and large, older folks that have thought this way for a long time, and that is an important aspect of overcoming a stigma, or any stigma, I suppose. Once we've gotten them there psychologically, I feel like that's 90% of the battle. From there, good, bad, or indifferent, the cannabis industry is hard to do business with. I don't know. Hopefully, you guys agree with me saying that. You have particular desires that you're looking for. People want, it's hard to get into the culture of it. And if you're not into the culture of it, you're often seen as an outsider, and thus it's hard for you to run a business that way. So that's usually the next challenge, which is, okay, you've accepted it, but your clients don't like you. So
yeah, Peter, I would certainly agree with you. My comment about it is, it's not a business, it's a cult. And I think there's very much that perception of it's a bit of a cult, and from the financial perspective, bankers and investors look and say, it's a high risk business. And that also, because it is designated as a high risk business, feeds into the question of pricing and regulation, and the regulatory side of banking and dealing with the regulators in any business is a nightmare. And for a high risk business, you can just double that.
The reality is, believe it or not, cannabis is not the only high risk vertical, right? So the truth is, I'm a fan of telling any institution that's thinking about it, well, do you currently bank other high risk verticals? If you do, conceptually, it's really not that different, right? it's the same basic principle. From a banking perspective, it always comes down to BSA, AML, so Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering, et cetera. So from a regulatory perspective, it's really not, there's nothing crazy that's going on here. Crypto is a very similar, has a very similar risk profile. The risk and reward is probably a little higher with respect to crypto. So.
That's probably just because there's so much more money in crypto.
Bigger amounts, yeah, and money that sits, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Question.
Oh wait, hold on. I want to comment on that. It's ironic though that the cannabis community, they are very closed as far as who they accept and et cetera. But I believe that is starting to open up because of the fact that it's hard to find investors that are within the cannabis community. And so me personally, I found a lot of success, going into mainstream, for cannabis companies to find those investors and those partnerships, and just kind of, like you said, educating them, about what's going on. And so that was just a kind of an interesting comment that you made. Alan, go right ahead.
Yeah, I got a question here. What kind of cannabis consulting do you do currently?
Is it just banking?
I'm not an independent consultant anymore. Now I work for Hanover Bank, so I'm back in banking, directly, I should say. I'm in the process. So I want to make it clear, we don't currently bank cannabis, but I'm in the process of building out a program. My third, a fact that I'm strangely proud of. So,
that's awesome. You should be proud of that.
That is awesome. Did you ever think that you would be writing about cannabis for Rolling Stones?
Actually, let me take a step back. I apologize if what I'm about to say sounds a little bit narcissistic, but I swear I have a point. Been in banking 20 plus years. I have a number of accolades. Chair this committee, chair that committee. I have 19 certifications and licenses. No one cares about any of that. Everybody always asks me about the Rolling Stones. No one cares that I'm certified in, I'm a certified blockchain expert, by the way. No one cares. No one ever asks me about that. People say, tell me about the Rolling Stones thing. So no, I did not think that I would ever be writing for Rolling Stone. It's fun. I have a byline. I'm able to submit articles for consideration. So meaning not guaranteed, but I've been fortunate to have a number of articles. My side is obviously more, I tend to write more about like the business of cannabis rather than, I try to be authentic, right? Like stay in my lane. I don't talk about flavors and flavonoids and terpenes and stuff like that. I talk about banking it and financing it, things like that.
That is really cool. You definitely have, you go on LinkedIn and you look up Peter Sue and you see an alphabet, the entire alphabet after your name. You have so many certifications.
But no one cares. No one cares.
No one cares. You just mentioned that you were a certified blockchain expert.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, well, as I mentioned, I worked for a bank that banked digital assets, and piqued my interest back then. I kind of stayed on top of the topic, and so I did do some of that type of business back then. In cannabis, the topic of using crypto payments and digital wallets and stuff like that comes up often. Again, you may have heard we have a payment problem. So at some point I thought, I can get more smarter on the topic. And so, yes, I did go to the Blockchain Council. I took a course, certified blockchain expert. So yeah, my thinking was actually more about, so specific to blockchain, right? Not crypto per se. In cannabis, as you know, we have the seed to sale tracking, this concept of seed to sale tracking. In my mind, blockchain that's the better answer for it versus what we currently have. So for a period of time, I toyed with this idea of like coming up with a better seed to sale tracking. But maybe that's still out there if any of you guys are interested in working with me on that.
That's definitely an interesting topic. I think that there's some people on here that would be
Yeah.
interested in working with you on that. So are you currently looking for investors, partnerships, or advisors for any projects that you're working with or for?
I don't necessarily, but as you can imagine, people reach out to me all the time on that, right? So whether it's a specific, whether it's a cannabis business or other sorts of cannabis related, or even just non-cannabis related, that does happen to me a lot, and I try to do my best actually to just make connections for them, even if I don't get paid on it or I'm not involved in any way. So yeah, so yes, that comes up all the time, but not for me personally, no.
Okay, good to know. And then out of all your certifications, which one?
Thank you for asking, by the way.
Yeah, which ones are your favorite?
Oh, well, obviously the certified blockchain. No, I'm just kidding.
Obviously.
Well, this is going to sound biased because I wrote some of these, but I do hold several certifications that are specific to cannabis, and I have this weird belief that I have the most certifications that are cannabis related. I can't prove it though.
That's wild. How many certifications in cannabis do you have?
Well, let me see. I'm a 1, 2, 3. So I have 4 that are specific to cannabis.
Wow. So does anybody else have any other questions?
Yes, Peter, I'd just like to get your perspective on something that I think is entirely new in the business. And that is one of the publicly traded cannabis companies, I can't think of the name offhand, but they just acquired 8 brands from Anheuser-Busch, which is basically, Budweiser.
So you're talking about Tilray, right? Yeah.
Yes, sorry, that's Tilray. So Tilray's acquired some very interesting, brands, Shock Top and another, some just, interest in your perspective. Do you see that as a potential widening of the, the types of businesses that particularly publicly traded cannabis companies might pursue? Or is this simply just kind of like a one-off, Bud Light hit a disaster and they had to...
No, I'm very bullish on the beverage, the cannabis beverage play. For better or for worse, we as a society, we're socially engineered to celebrate with a drink. People like to clink glasses, right? Nobody clinks joints. So the idea that you could replace alcohol with a THC drink, right? So at the end of the day, there's an intoxicant, whether that is alcohol or THC based. Conceptually, it's the same. No one has cracked that nut yet, by the way. Like market share is something like 2%, is cannabis beverages. But I think everyone agrees that they see the logic that could be a real play. Now I'm making an assumption here. This is just me saying, like, Tilray didn't say this, but logically that's what they're thinking, that there is a play here that could work. I don't necessarily know why the beverage market has not taken off. If I had to guess, I would say the beverage business is hard. It takes a long time to get a flavor right. If you think about like the whiskey business, for example, I don't know if you know, I only just learned this recently. So if you don't know it either, that's okay, because I just learned this recently. In order for something to be called whiskey, right, it has to have sat in the barrel for at least 10 years. Mm-hmm. So I think the point is that, like, we're not even in the first inning of beverages, of cannabis beverages, right? It could take a long time to launch beverage companies and very capital intensive, et cetera, et cetera. So whether it's the taste, the formulation, and then from a science perspective, THC as a molecule is not water soluble. So to insert that into a drink is just scientifically troublesome. So for all those reasons, again, to answer your question, I think, I'm a big believer in all the sort of nibbling around the edges, right? Industrial hempcrete, cannabis beverages. But yes, the current market does not suggest that that's actually true.
And I think there's another interesting aspect to that, and that's really the business side. Because if you again look at something like beer, again, it's a controlled substance. You can't sell it to anybody under 21. You have to have a license as a retailer to sell it. Those licenses in many jurisdictions are expensive. And then you have a very organized network of beer distributors.
Infrastructure.
And I'm sort of starting to wonder will there be maybe a meld, will former Bud Light distributors now say, gosh, God, we have this network of this distributorship, we got to do something else with it. And maybe, move into something like cannabis.
Well, so I don't know if this is getting too nerdy, but if you look at the way how a certain states legalize, right, like what regulatory path they follow, you can kind of see what the writers of that policy was thinking, what they think the future of cannabis looks like. So, medical, meaning FDA versus alcohol, right? So in New York, for example, it's clear, and they make it's no secret, like our OCM is actually under the Alcohol Commission, the TLA. So the SLA, excuse me. So in other words, if you're envisioning a future where cannabis is federally legal, what regulatory regime will it fall under? And if I can make my regulatory regime follow that, the transition to federal legality will be smoother. So in New York, again, they're following the alcohol. But the reason I bring this up is lobbyists. So who are the lobbyists that are spending money to do that? So if you're in a state like Florida, you see it's very medically geared, right? And the lobbyists are pushing for that. And when there's market share established, of course, suddenly you see that they're changing direction.
And remember, at the federal level, who's the regulator of alcohol? It's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. It's a very strange regulatory entity.
Right.
I just want to segue in terms of regulations. Come to New York because everybody I talk to, I hear New York City has this enormous gray market in cannabis.
Is that right?
I was going to ask your perspective.
Yes, we do. I think we made an interesting choice, and I want to call it a mistake. So we legalized and decriminalized simultaneously. Now, those may sound like similar concepts, but of course, they do take different paths. So, legalization, of course, says, well, here's the path. Here's how you get licensed, here's how you stay licensed, et cetera. Decriminalization says, well, there's no crime. So frankly, that is what happened to us on a very simplistic level, right? If possessing cannabis is no longer illegal, there's no crime with which you can be charged with, then how are you going to catch the illegal stores? What are you charging them with? So think about this. If 10 years ago you were willing to sell cannabis and the penalty was 10 years in prison, now the penalty is a fine, possibly, right? What is preventing you from doing so? Right? Not much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob, for your participation. Appreciate those questions. We're going to close up today. Peter, thank you for joining us. Please tell our viewers that we know you're not consulting, but if they have questions, how can they reach you?
Well, I'm happy to consult. I'm happy to chat. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. Peter Su on LinkedIn.
Okay, wonderful. Alan, can you please close for today's show?
Yeah, Peter, thank you for joining us today. Please tell the viewers how to reach us. So you told us Peter Su at LinkedIn. Make sure you go follow him. Before I close in prayer, we want to express our gratitude to each and every one of you for joining us today. And we can't wait to have you back next Friday for another exciting episode. If you haven't already, we encourage you to follow our YouTube channel and connect us with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Stay up to date updated on all the latest content and announcements. Let's keep the conversations going and build a thriving community together. If we can close in prayer, let's bow down and pray. Heavenly gracious Father, dear God, thank you for being our midst another week in our CryptoCannaVerse Show. God, you have just always prepared us with the right people in the right time, right place to get together so we can learn from each other, inspire each other, and help each other grow. Continue to work in us and through us and among us in all things that we do, knowing that with your perfect time, you will help us in any situation that we're in. So continue to watch over this group, and I pray that we have a good weekend. In Christ's name we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. If everyone wouldn't mind staying on for 5 more minutes, I'm going to end the show. Thank you, Alan. And we'll just have a few quick minutes to